Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and this one we have several Russian advances across the front line in the eastern section, both in the direction of the Serebets River line in the north, in the direction of the Kurakhove, Selidove, Pokrovsk directions in the south, and even further south there's some advances of the Russians in the fortified fields in the Zaporizhia region. The Ukrainians in turn made some gains here in the Kharkiv region where they recaptured some territory. Starting out in the south, the Russians advanced here north of Kopani, where they managed to capture some of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians may be looking to capture more and more of the fortified positions here northwest of Robotyne in an attempt to improve the positions west of the main road, the highway between Robotyne and Novodanilivka, to launch a future operation towards the settlement in the north. Moving further north, we see here in the direction of Yakhtarsk and Yasna Polyana, there's a small advance by the Russians capturing a single forest line. To the east, there are several Russian advances, both in the direction of Yelisavetivka here in the northeast, where the Russians managed to reach the outskirts from the eastern direction, and in the southern direction, where the Russians have captured the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the south of the settlement chain. At the same time, the Russians have advanced north of Boryavlenka, securing the northern flank and advancing along the road towards Trudova and the general village agglomeration here along the river line. We see the Russians are planning on an operation towards Yelisavetivka in the east and Vesely High in the west, as well as Trudovo further west, attacking all of the southern settlements from the southern direction following the capture of Boryavlenka and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. In the Kurakhove direction, the Russians have managed to capture Stepanivka and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians related to that, to now fight over the fortified positions near Elinka, where to the southeast, northeast, and the northern direction there are several fortified positions of the Ukrainians, which the Russians are now fighting over. This leads to the Russians slightly slowing down as they continue fighting along the river line, the Vovcha river line here to the south, to capture the remaining settlements, as the Russians will slowly move through the fortified positions of the Ukrainians to capture these. At the same time, the Russians are fighting in Novoselidivka in the north and Voznesenka further west. In the northwestern direction, the Russians have advanced within Novodimitrivka, where they've managed to reach the western part along the main road. Here, the Ukrainians are sending armored vehicles to hit the Russian infantry advancing slowly through the settlement. The area here is very interesting because there's only a few buildings far in between each other, which makes it difficult for the infantry to advance from one building to another, while the Ukrainians have a second settlement of Surya where they can operate from, going back and forth in between. With the cover of the settlement in the rear, they're able to regularly use their armored vehicles to hold back Russian advances, and with active mechanized brigades in the area, they're able to slow down the Russian advances from that. At the same time, the Russians launched an armored assault from this southern direction. They moved along the forest lines before reaching Novo-Oleksivka, where they here started storming the settlement and fought over it, dropping off some infantry, while the Ukrainians was resisting heavily and sending a lot of FPV drones and artillery that then slowed down the Russian advance and limited it. Before the Russians managed to capture the settlement, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within Novo-Oleksivka, but the Ukrainians still hold the western and northern parts of the settlement. To the north of Selidove, there are two advances here as well. The Russians advance along the main road towards the northern parts, where they now have a second road towards Ryurivka, the northern parts of the settlement, and are advancing towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near the intersection, where they look to gain control over that before advancing further north along the E50 highway. At the same time, there's a small advance by the Russians, which was geolocated here in the south of Lysivka, where the Russians have managed to capture some more of the forest lines fields here in the area. The Russians are generally moving to the south of Pokrovsk along the Lysivka-Dachenske fortified area of the Ukrainians. Moving on to the north of Bakhmut in the Ivano-Derivska direction, south of Siversk, the Russians managed to re-enter the settlement, and they're fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of the Sukha-Plotva river, and they're fighting within the settlement itself. This is shown with this geolocated footage here. So we see that there is constant fighting in the area despite how destroyed the settlement is, and despite the Russians yet to capture the fortified positions in the northern direction, they still re-enter Ivano-Derivka. I really question sometimes why they keep re-entering these settlements. What is the strategic or tactical or operational objective with these operations? I don't really understand, considering they could just stay from afar and continuously bombard it, and if they wanted to actually capture the settlement, then they would need to capture the fortified position, yet they have not done that, which again, this is why I question why they keep entering the settlement when they end up being pushed out again, because there's no cover within it. In the direction of the Serbets river line, the Russians managed to advance further, capturing several fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the forest lines, and now within close proximity to Yampolivka and Torske from the northeast of Torske, southeast of Yampolivka. So there's generally a lot of fighting along the Serbets river line, the remaining parts of it, which has become very small, following the Russian capture of Novosadove, Nevsky, and Makiivka in the north. This has led to the Ukrainians and Russians concentrating their forces in a smaller area, which makes it more difficult for the Russians to advance, because they use similar-sized units in assault groups to advance, but the Ukrainians now have a smaller area to cover with their FPV drones and artillery. However, the Russians still have gained an advantage with this, which is they are now able to advance from several directions at the same time. They have 3 directions into Terni, they have multiple directions developing into Yampolivka, and they have multiple directions into Torske as well as the fighting continues. However, as was mentioned by Zodiac Maps, if the Russians want to develop an operation towards Torske and Liman, they would need to cover and regain control over the Serebryanki forest area south of Kreminna to secure the southern flank. As long as the Ukrainians hold this area, this forest area in the south, the Russians would have a difficult time reaching into and gaining control over the settlements along the Serbets river line, and then moving on to Liman as well. Further north in the Kharkiv direction, the Ukrainians managed to recapture parts here west of Lyubovka. With this geolocated footage, we see the Ukrainian presence in the area along the river line, along the reservoir, and with this we see that the Ukrainians yet again continue positional fighting around Lyubovka, and the Russians are holding on to it to simply hold on to this buffer zone, which redirects Ukrainian forces away from the south and from the east. Now, I have a comment on the North Korean soldiers. It was first claimed that the North Korean soldiers would go into the Kursk region and they would fight the Ukrainians in the Kursk region. Then Zelensky said they would enter Monday, which is now Tuesday, yet they have not started fighting. Or was it Monday of last week? Either way, the North Korean soldiers have not engaged in any battle, but they are within the Kursk region. This makes me believe that the objective of the North Korean soldiers being in Russia is not to fight and quick out the Ukrainians from the Kursk region, but instead to prepare them, and in case the Ukrainians start another offensive in the Bryansk or Belgorod regions, or an extra one in the Kursk region, then they would be able to respond. So they would have a extra squad, extra 12,000 soldiers to redirect to defend the border area in case the Ukrainians want to start a new offensive within Russian territory. So this is to rule out the Ukrainians entering Russia again by sending additional troops from other countries to help defend the border area. So this is simply my assessment based on this post by a group of a Russian war correspondent group where they communicate a lot with Russian soldiers. According to this group, they claim that the Ukrainians are gathering approximately 221 Striker APCs, 170 Swedish PBV 302 APCs. There was some 128 French VAB APCs, 20 German and Danish Leopard tanks, 10 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, 17 Bandvan, 206 all-terrain vehicles, and 10 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. That is a significant amount of armored personnel carriers in the hundreds. However, with this large concentration of armored personnel carriers and a smaller, much smaller amount of other types of vehicles, makes me believe that it's not about a new offensive, but instead simply allowing the Ukrainians to evacuate soldiers from the front line or transport soldiers to the front line to have a mechanized force which reduces casualties from artillery firing and FPV drone firing throughout the transport of troops. We recently saw a Russian drone filming the Ukrainian withdrawal from Maksimivka, where the Ukrainians evacuated their soldiers in the northern outskirts of the settlement with armored personnel carriers. If they didn't have those, they'd have to walk through the field, which we have seen multiple times. Started out in the direction of Avdiivka, where following the Russian capture of the city, the Ukrainians walked from settlement to settlement out in the open fields, which led to heavy casualties from Russian MLRS, cluster munitions, and other long-range fire, which hit the Ukrainian soldiers. Similarly, in the direction of Volodar, no armored vehicles got close enough, so they simply had to walk away, and this led to a lot of casualties. If they had the armored personnel carriers, which is arriving in the hundreds, then the Ukrainians would be able to withdraw with much less casualties. But at the same time, this does not rule out the Ukrainians launching a new offensive, and I believe the North Korean soldiers in the north is to deal with the possibility of that. The Ukrainians can just forget about it, is pretty much the idea. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for everyone who's supporting me so far. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.